was very interesting when I was doing some research and kind of looking at what people were saying about women in Africa. I read a quote that said, women need to be given a positive voice. And I looked at it and I thought, something is wrong with this statement because it is so passive. It is saying that we need to be given something, we need a handout from someone, when actually we need to claim that voice. And I think that is what the conversation today is all about, is claiming our rightful place. Felicia read Tom Brokaw quote saying, it's such a heavy burden and to be a woman in Africa, and I believe that we are more than beasts of burden, that we need to really stake our claim. And there were two schools of thought which I want to get the panel involved in. In my reading, there were two schools of thought. One, that the African woman is destitute, abused, marginalized, undermined. Two, that the African woman is angry, argumentative, opinionated, and entitled. Neither one of these are particularly positive, as you may have noticed. So our panel is discussing today redefining African women, or the definition of African women. And somebody has to kick it off. Lindiwe, I want to ask you, do we need to be redefined? Do we need any more labels? Do we really need to be redefined? And if so, what does that mean?
Samantha, I don't think we need to be redefined. I think we need to be the definers. I think it's our responsibility to set the tone, to cast the mold ourselves, instead of inviting others, either from other parts of the world or from the opposite gender, to actually do the defining for us. And I was thinking a little bit about the subject of today's discussion. What does the redefinition entail? What does an African woman look like? How old is she? What manner does she possess? And I thought through some of the stereotypes myself. And the first thing that struck me when I arrived today was that, first of all, the African woman is not one skin color. She ranges in skin color, in language, in background. She may be white, she may be Arab speaking, she may be Swahili or Sizulu or any other African language speaking, she may be Afrikaans. She is defined by her decision to choose to be an African and to be of Africa and to be representative of Africa. That's a major stereotype that needs redefining. The other one I thought of when I walked in today was how old is the African woman? The woman you've just described, who is either a victim, passive, suffering, carrying a burden, a child on her head, a bucket of water, a child on her back, a bucket of water on her head, is older, maternal, suffering. But the average age of African men and women on this continent is just under 19. So the average African woman is a teenager. She's a teenager, which means she's modern and she has different priorities to the stereotypical suffering and maternal life that the stereotypical African woman has been saddled with. So I think our responsibility is to take a combination of the facts and our experiences and both redefine who the African woman is based on fact, but also based on how we want to portray African women to the rest of the world. And we can do that in the first place by what we do as leaders in our field, because of course we're all preaching to the choir here. Successful women, beautifully dressed, able to travel, board flights all over the world. I heard us all nodding and humming and hawing when the discussion about the flight connection through London was discussed. Very few of our fellow Africans are able to experience that kind of life because we still have an economic problem on this continent. So our responsibility must be to redefine what African female leadership looks like, but then also to bring more and more young people with us, mentor them, inspire them, show them, and make sure that in 10 years' time we're not still having this discussion. Is the African woman still, the traditional stereotype, or has she been modernized, made younger, more vibrant, and more exciting?
I think you've touched on two very key points there. That this conference, when I read the kind of lineup of the conference, was about instructing or educating the younger generations that, you know, all of us, as you say, the converted and the choir, that we are laying the groundwork for future generations. Earlier, Ratang and I were talking about not defining yourself. And this is something that young women, I think, need to learn as early as possible. That you're not defined by, you know, your skill set. And Ratang, that's something that, you know, in the job that you took on, you didn't let that phase you at all.
Coming from a banking background, I'm not a diamond person by background. I spent many years in banking, and I did not know anything about diamonds. And I was sharing earlier on that I've been turned down for so many jobs wanting to be a CEO. And when this opportunity came, I never looked back and say, you know, I applied for these many jobs where I thought I qualified. I just believed in myself, and one of the things that I strongly believe defines us as women in Africa is that our foundation starts at home. My mother was a housewife, but she instilled a sense of belief in all the 6 of us in the family. And that nobody can take away from you, because as you go to an area of unknown, like going into a diamond industry, your self-belief is the only thing that makes you know that you can do it. Even if you don't have the experience, you can do it. And joining the diamond industry, where it was the first local person to take over a world-leading diamond company, it was challenging, but I wasn't scared that I can take on the responsibilities. I kind of look back at what my mother did with 6 of us as kids, and she didn't have like a full-time job, but we became what we were. And I said, if she could do it back then and brought us 6 children, why can't I take this one? And I think that's African women have always defined the economy of any organization or the economy of any country. And I think that's the self-belief that we need to drive our way forward.
I completely agree with that. And, you know, Sheryl Sandberg, Felicia mentioned Sheryl Sandberg, and in her book, Lean In, she says, she uses 2 examples of a jungle gym and the corporate ladder. And she says, you know, if you continuously climb the corporate ladder, all you ever see is the behind of somebody else. And there's only ever one way up. Whereas if you take the jungle gym route, you have so many different ways to get to the top. And you don't also limit yourself with only one set of circumstances. I mean, Julie, you've taken on so many different roles. Mother being one of them, mother to 5 being one of them. How early do we start engaging men as women who are raising sons? I don't think we can leave men out of the discussion.
Absolutely, that's so critical. But let me approach this from the issue that you started with, which is the definition or the stereotype of the African woman. I totally believe that the African woman is the custodian of Mother Africa. She is the one, the grandmothers we see in the villages who, when perhaps parents have passed away of AIDS, and we know in some places this is a serious issue, are looking after numerous grandchildren, bringing them up, or in urban areas. And this is happening in Kenya, where you've got a lot of single parent mothers struggling but getting their children through school. So whatever the situation is, whether it's rural or urban, you're seeing a lot of women who are extremely enterprising, may have a job but also have a small business, doing a little bit of trade, you know, making sure that children have food at the end of the day, possibly supporting relatives somewhere else who come to them. That is who the African woman is. She's kept Africa alive. And I think the biggest challenge that we have, there are a couple of things I think are important. I think cross-generational learning is critical as women. What can I learn from my mother and my grandmother? So I was very blessed that I got to live with my grandmother for a period of time. My mom wasn't there. And you know, I was able to like soak so much knowledge in from her. And we have amazing women of a different generation who can tell us so much. We don't have to learn some of the lessons of life, you know, as we go along. There's also the issue now, which is this gender issue. Now, I'm a girl who grew up with 3 brothers, no sisters. I've had 4 sons, one daughter. And I totally buy into the idea that if you're going to change this dynamic, you must bring the boys on board. So you must have husbands, fathers, sons, brothers who are not threatened by a strong woman, who want to support their wives, to have good businesses, to do well out there, because they know at the end of the day it has a positive impact on them. It doesn't threaten them. If we don't bring the guys along with us, we cannot win this effort. So I totally believe in empowering the girl child and strengthening the boy child, so they walk hand in hand. And I hope it's something that we can buy into, because right now what's happening in many of our communities, men are feeling threatened whenever they hear about the girl child. They immediately get worried. And just another thing, in some countries like Rwanda, where Paul Kagame has this amazing policy where he has women in government, I think it's over 50%, and somebody can confirm to me, but that's government policy. In Kenya, I think we're under, where are we? Just over 10%, maybe about 18%. Wow. Senator Zipporah Kitoni is here, and she can share more on that with us. But it's terrible. Now, when it comes to forming policy, that affects everything. And I just want to touch on maternal health care.
Yes.
The number of women dying needlessly in childbirth, or children as well dying needlessly in childbirth. Why? Because maternal health care is just not prioritized by governments, because there are too many men there who don't think it's important. So I mean, it's things like that that are critical.
Lindiwe, on the issue of policy and economics, this is something that I think is integral to this whole discussion. Should it be policy? Because we're hearing all the time these staggering numbers of women that are still not in government, that are still not CEOs. The numbers are so small, they're too small to even mention sometimes. Should it be policy that we up those numbers, or do we do we fall into the same trap that we've fallen into with equity numbers, where people get put in positions because we need to up the numbers, but they're not necessarily equipped, and that's setting people up for failure? What are your thoughts on that?
Before I answer that question, I want to sound a note of caution. I think it becomes very easy when we're preaching to the choir and talking to each other at forums like this to be very optimistic and smiley and happy about women, and women can do this, and we must educate the boy child. It's not happening. In my country, in South Africa, in my province, in KwaZulu-Natal, young boys aged 20 are raping grandmothers. It's happening. What is it about them that's so broken that they feel that in order to express their manhood, they have to assault a woman who's old enough to be 2 generations ahead of them, to be their grandmother? I'm sitting next to the only female CEO in Botswana. How can that be? How can that be? Why do we applaud that? It's a massive achievement. But why don't we ask the question, where are the other female CEOs? And why aren't they also being given the space to make the choice to advance into leadership positions? And so I think it's very, very important that we look the realities of our circumstances in the face, and then ask ourselves, what kind of future are we hoping to build as leaders on a continent where, if the average age is 19, but there are no women in leadership positions, where are those women? Are they unemployed? Are they being are they being relegated to a permanent life of looking after men, of being the supporter rather than the instigator in the family? I mean, these are questions we must ask. And finally, when we talk about men not being threatened by female success, we must ask why they are in the first place. Why is it to a man that a woman who is outspoken, it happens to me in my career when I speak out in parliament, people call me a little girl, a tea girl, or whatever, or my female colleagues, Patricia DeLille, Helen Ziller, they're called dragons and concubines, and they're called all kinds of things. Why is it that it is so easy and so comfortable for our society to be misogynistic towards successful women and view them either as a kind of a slut or as a monster or as an aberration? And what can we do to change that, rather than just talking about it? What can we do to change those perceptions so that the generation ahead of us doesn't have to go through the same things that we are going through? And so that the generation ahead of us, women like Albertina Sisulu and Helen Suzman, in my case, who laid the foundations for me to be able to be a female politician, that their work doesn't go realized because we simply slide back into this maternal, subjugated, passive role. So I think we need to look these hard questions in the eye. And when we talk about what we're going to do to redefine the role of African women, be active about it, rather than to say it should be this, it should be that, it can be that. We must talk about what we're going to do to enable more and more women to be this new breed of African women who is emerging on the continent, but who is in too few numbers. So on the question of policy and quotas, and whenever I travel around the world, I encounter women in other political formations, the House of Representatives in the United States, the House of Commons in the US, etc., the Bundestag in Germany, and they say to me, what is the female representation in the South African Parliament? I say it's about 40-45% of MPs and cabinet ministers in this country are women. And they say, wow, you must have gone like a long way towards addressing some of the patriarchal, sexist problems in your society. And I say, well, actually, no, we haven't. We are sitting in our twin suits with our pearls on in the house. But in South Africa, the status of women hasn't changed. And what that leads me to believe is that the simple existence of female representation does not amount to the emancipation of women. Because it's very, very sexist to assume that only women will be responsible for championing women's issues, because often they don't. Naledi Pandors is busy managing the entire Home Affairs turnaround. She's been given a responsibility that doesn't fall squarely in the gender area. So she can't also then be saddled with that responsibility. Or Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma or Helen Zille, or all the politicians who are doing important work, they can't also be responsible for gender equality. It's got to be a man's responsibility as well. So the question for me is, does the policy lead to the outcome of improved circumstances for women? And in my view, at the moment, it doesn't. What it means is that those of us who are at the top, or those who are at the top, are able to dictate their futures. In Norway, they have this problem of women's quotas on boards, which is it's entrenched in law. But what it means is that a few women are able to sit on multiple boards at the top, while the body politic doesn't experience the same kind of transformation. So, and they're called golden skirts, because they have 10 board memberships per person. So we mustn't assume that by having women at the top, that automatically filters down, any more than we can assume that by having black people at the top, everything filters down into transformation.
It needs to be a more integrated it needs to be a more integrated policy, that it is part of everything. And I think that there's this kind of subtext to everything, to advertisements, to what our children are reading at school, where women are seen as lesser. I read something about whether somebody had posed a question: are successful women under attack? It's not so much being under attack, but I think, it's maybe that successful women are not doing enough to further the cause of other women. Felicia said it right at the beginning about bending down and picking people up. Julie, in your, in the scope of your work, is that something that you focus on in uplifting younger generations, and how do you do that? Because I think what we really want to get out of these 2 days is practical issues, because Lindiwe made a very, very valid point that they say it's the best time for women to be alive now, but women have never been more afraid, more guilt-ridden, more abused than they are right now, in South Africa particularly. So, in practical terms.
Let's just be honest, the challenges in Africa are numerous. So in terms of my foundation, the Footprints Africa Foundation, my husband and I set up, what we do right now, we have a campaign where we go to children, and it's boys and girls. We take shoes and we take hygiene education. This is how serious the situation is. You have jiggers in villages. We have a campaign also that is called the Great Debaters Contest. It's a high school competition. Now, this is where you start to impact on the psyche. And what we do, we have a lot of Africa topics. We have a lot of gender-based topics. We have a lot of topics that get young people, both boys and girls, thinking about some of these key issues. And we inject, for instance, the gender issue. And we get the boys team to debate on the side side of the women,
fantastic.
and we get the girls team to, you understand what I mean? So this we're doing actively, but I want to talk about a lady called Dr. Susan Boya. I don't know, does anybody know what she does? I see some hands going up. So Susan in Kenya started something called the Zawadi Trust, and what she does is identifies accomplished girls in high school who do well, who have no chance of making it to university, and she takes them, and she has a relationship with Ivy colleges in the States and many other universities, and right now she's placing hundreds of girls from Kenya every year, and it's just making up your mind where you are now, that guess what, I can do something. If I have $10, I can do something. If I have 100, I can do something. If I have networks, I can do something. So for me, I am seeing transformation, and truly the challenges are there. We can never ignore that fact, but we just have to make up our minds that in some way, if I can make a difference, I'll just stand up and do it. Just stand up and do it, and I see it happening.
And Rutang was actually saying exactly that, about just taking the baton and running with it.
Absolutely. And what I liked about what Lindiwe said is that as the generation leaders today, what is it that we want to do? I mean, there could be so many policies advocating what we need to do. And I keep going back to this issue about everything starts at home. Coming from a family of 6, I was the first one to go to university. And I think what defines African women, you see this African women with so much glam, especially in the diamond industry, you assume it's so much glam. But you have to take a responsibility beyond the current job and say, I'm not going to be the only one going to university in my home. I took on my sister when I just graduated because I didn't want her to go and grow up in a village. So I could nurture her, and she got the second one to go to university, the last born in the family. And I think for me, that's the kind of legacy we want to leave, even in our jobs, to say what support can we really give to the upcoming people with potential, whether it's a boy or it's a girl. What can we do? How do we multiply? Why is it just me? And the other thing that I wanted to note, going back to this family issue, is that we shouldn't underestimate the value that our parents, no matter whether they went to no university, that they do offer. My mother is my pillar. She's 75 years old. Last year, she was diagnosed with cancer. And I said, I am going to take this head on. She was 3B, and I said, I am not going to give up my job. I'm not going to take day off. I took my mother from the village. She stayed with me for a whole year. Today, I can testify that she's healed. And I had to drop her off at the hospital in the morning and go to work and pick her up to take her back home. And the message around this is that we need to demonstrate that if our parents could do it with 6 kids, even if I don't have a child, I can afford to look after my ailing mother and still do my role today and showcase to the young people that you can actually do it. And those are the strengths that we need to continue to show others, that it's not just because I don't have kids of my own, I should forget about the responsibilities of being an African child. So I think the key point really is the growth that we can tap into others, into our parents, into our siblings, in the network that we have among women, and sharing these stories that we can help us to grow and grow others.
Do you think that women generally, or women limit themselves in their thinking because they are so shackled by, the economic situation, the abuse, and the labels that they have been given over the years, that they limit themselves and box themselves in?
One of the interesting things that Cheryl Sanborn talks about in Lean In is the phenomenon of women slowing down before they're required to, particularly young women, planning for futures that haven't yet materialized. And it happens to me a lot. Whenever I get interviewed, I'm unmarried, I don't have children, I'm 33 years old. Whenever I'm interviewed, I'm asked, do you want to be president? I say, of course I want to be president one day. And then they say, how will you balance your family and the job of being head of a government? I say, I don't have a family. No, but you'll have one in the future. I say, I hope I'll have one in the future. But how will you and it's almost as though they're trying to limit me for me, because I haven't bothered to limit myself. I must must limit myself. I must slow down. I must think of this hypothetical family and these hypothetical children that don't actually exist yet. And so the pressure to actually slow yourself down is immense. And the pressure to pass that slowing down onto others is also immense, because I imagine if I did have a family, if I did have children, I would look at the young women in politics that I mentor and I'd say the same. I'd be like, well, it's quite difficult. Make sure you make room. But, men don't do that. Men aren't asked when they're in interviews if they're planning to have children or if they've just gotten married or if they're fertile, but they have children too. They have families. So I think it's very, very important that women not be agents of holding other women back and not be actively involved in holding themselves back. And again, when we talk about redefining the African woman, she has to be somebody who is in a relationship of equals. There has to be space for us to say, we're modern, it's 2013, and it's possible for a woman of the future to make compromises. I mean, again, Sheryl Sandborn says she doesn't have it all. She has to go to work. She has to hire help. Her husband, she's lucky. Her husband doesn't, have a full-time occupation. He's made his money. So there are compromises that she has to make, and she's not always there for her children. But she knows that, she's also becoming the kind of role model that her daughters and that other women will be able to look up to. And that's a sacrifice. But to start to limit yourself and limit others on the basis of things that haven't happened, I think is one of the great dangers of being a successful woman or a woman in a traditionally male industry or male field.
Okay, can I come in here? Between 27 years old, 5 children, I finished at 36. But those were the key years of my career development. At no point, actually, and let me give you the good news, family doesn't limit you. And for those of you that are not married, don't ever approach family or marriage like it will be limiting. If you find the right man, it enhances you. There's nothing like getting home at the end of a long day and my children unwinding me and giving me the spirit to fight on the next day. You know what I mean? When you look at a woman who has children or nephews and nieces, there's nothing she won't do to fight for them.
Absolutely.
That energy and that vigor that we have in our home to protect those we love, we need to unabashedly take that into the workplace. To be able to sit in a boardroom and say, I'm fighting for my company, or I'm fighting for my right to have this seat. I don't see gender. Because I'm capable, I can do this. So I think also, it's society, again, that has made us feel that we're limited by family, but not at all. My husband's a very traditional African man, but he's called me to say the kids had their medicine in the morning and they're off to school and all is well. And it's absolutely fine. So, it's about making sure that you find the right person and you have a balance that makes you, feel, I can't get on with work without feeling guilty about what's going on in the home.
I think therein lies the rub. It is finding the right man. Because Sheryl Sandberg says,
all women for our lesbian
the right
women,
partner.
yes.
The right partner. Because, Sheryl Sandberg says in the Lean In, she said, finding the right partner is half the battle for you. In seeing the scope of your life, because it becomes so much harder when you don't have the right person supporting you and that you're not surrounded by positive people who are egging you on actually to move ahead. And I say the rub because it seems like choice is a big issue for young women. Choice seems to be where it all goes either right or wrong, and it is about making those good choices, I think, that ultimately defines one way or the other.
Well, again, unfortunately, only women are ever taught that they have to choose. Men are not taught that they have to choose. They are taught that having a family is the thing that will anchor them, that will provide them with stability, and that will enable them to move forward. They pose next to their wives if they're politicians, and it's seen as an extension of them. A woman who does the same thing is seen as selfish and thoughtless and bullshit, and actually should be back in the hearth supporting some man because that's her responsibility.
I think
what I'd like to also do, Samantha, I can see heads, people are nodding and agreeing.
And Felicia, did we get some questions on
Definitely.
Twitter as well? Because
I'd love
I think
us
there
to
was
do
some.
that. I'd really like us to integrate some questions as well.
So let's
but go ahead, continue. We still have another 15 minutes.
If you are burning to ask any of the panelists a question, please do just raise your hand.
Do you have a roving mic around here, by any chance? Okay.
Here,
Can you be Phil Donahue and come around with the mic?
This lady right in front here.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Samantha.
This lady's got a question right here. Oh, are we getting a mic to her? There we go. Here, right in front. Sorry, I can't read your name from...
I'll mention it.
Okay, okay. There you go. There's the mic.
Can you kindly stand up, my dear? That's power.
My name is Nanada Konsechiema. What I want to know from the three ladies on the panel is, when are you going to write your autobiographies? Because we've referenced Sheryl Sandberg a lot today.
True.
And I'm thinking all of you are so inspirational, and I want to read your stories because I'll be able to relate to you a whole lot more than I can relate to Sheryl Sandberg.
Right. Okay, you can have one right now. Give her a hand.
Before the panelists answer, because I do want them to answer, and I'm sure Lindiwe has a book, and Julie and Rutang just bursting to write that book. It was something that all of the panelists and I talked about earlier this morning when we were mulling around. The lack of these kinds of forums, particularly in Cape Town. I just want to say that it often happens in Johannesburg and elsewhere. So that first off. And again, you know, the limiting factor, I think, where either we limit ourselves or we don't think our story is worth telling. And I think it's an issue of worth sometimes, that we think that we are not enough, we are not smart enough, and who would be interested anyway? Well, I certainly would be interested in hearing from the panel on when their books are coming out so we can go out and buy them.
I wanted to take this one up. I like what Felicia said when she started. She talked about rubbing shoulders with people who are doing very well. Take advantage of any opportunity for your autobiography to be heard. About a month ago, I was asked to address a convention of secretaries. And I remember writing my bio, looking at the famous women in the world, and I said, this is the start of my autobiography. I'm not going to limit it to I'm addressing this group of people. Whether it's not an international convention, I'll write it at an international standards. And that way, I think it builds into setting your standards from the onset, and it will open more doors for our autobiographies to be heard.
Yes. And you know, the whole, you know, her name's been mentioned a lot, Sheryl Sandberg, and I'm wondering, you know, what is it? Why are so many people talking about this particular book? Katie Katapodis has just recently released a book as well. I missed the news, I think it's called, and she's a newswoman who is also a mother, and she talks about, you know, exactly that. And we were discussing why it seems you cannot fling a cat without hitting Sheryl Sandberg at some point. And maybe there are just not enough of these books out there that when one does appear and it's a little controversial and she's the new face of feminism and all of that everybody has latched onto it. I do think, though, that advice, no matter where it comes from, there were some really key issues raised that I hadn't heard before, like the jungle gym and the ladder. So absolutely we should be reading widely, and particularly literature from the African continent, because it's so much more in tune with where we are.
Can I just say that I have a blog. It's www.juliegichuru.com, where I started telling my stories, just short little stories. And you know, when we achieve success, people can't look at you and imagine the journey you traveled. So for instance, one of the stories where I talk about in university taking 3 jobs, one of those jobs was in a factory packing crumpets from 7 at night to 7 in the morning. And the number of young people who said, oh my goodness, Julie, I believe now I can get there. So I totally understand what you're saying. And if you can't write a book, then do a blog.
Blog, tweet, be part of the conversation and put yourself at the table. You know, your story probably is worth telling just as much as somebody who has a title. I don't think it has anything to do with titles. I think that everybody's life is a story that needs to be told.
And I always say that you don't have to write a book to be a bestseller. You write a book to tell your story, your history.
Absolutely.
I was just talking about Johanna earlier, and I said in my next book I talk about how she celebrated her 35th birthday, and had us all there. And she said, I don't want to hear it when I'm dead. I want to hear it while I'm still alive. So write that book. I was not writing my book for it to be a bestseller. I was writing it for my children to know what the journey has been. And that's a memoir. I saw Basi walk in here. I mean, here's a young girl from the township. Is it Muletan? Protea, yeah. Ending up, do you know how many little girls from Protea, from Deep Soweto, from somewhere in Nigeria, who want to be Miss South Africa one day and ultimately becomes an entrepreneur of note? I bet you the young lady from Nigeria who became Miss Universe, was it Miss Universe? Yeah, so that's what the story is. We have to change perception in writing. Sorry, I love your stories, and I'll be the first to buy the book.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Before the mic gets to the speaker, I wanted to say I think that one of the reasons Lean In has also become such a phenomenon is because feminism has been unfashionable for a very long time. It's been something that people have turned their nose up. You know, it's not feminine. Keep it down. You've got an education now. You can vote. It's fine. So to hear a woman actually talk about in a modern United States context some of the things we don't know about how few CEOs there are in the United States, for starters, and to talk quite strongly about feminist principles in a way that women can connect with, but didn't realize, it was okay to connect with, I think is quite new. And I think it needs to be replicated more, so that she's not the lone voice of modern feminism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hello, I am Dawa Logelenberger, representing Malawi Fashion Week in Malawi. But one of the things I wanted to say, I was just relating to everything you said, especially Lindiwe. For me, I've been in U.S. for too long, I think 14 years. Went back to Malawi. Right now it's the time that I feel to be in Africa to support and do different things. At 26, I was a vice president of a bank, and at that time it's like, the black, young, and within all white company, which is in the Midwest. And that comes with all the different challenges. But then now my husband is in U.S. and I'm in Africa, and you get to do different things. And one of the comments that I received from somebody who said, what is she doing? She's so young. There's so many people who've been outside the country and they came back and they're so humble. They don't get to do much, and she's in the newspaper all the time. And to them, they still look at me as a young person, a woman, who maybe is talking too much about something that they're trying to not want to understand, just because the limitations of being a woman and young, to them, it's something that's not acceptable. And these are comments.
The question? I think I just have 1 minute left.
Okay.
And so you have a good president already. She's a great example. Joyce Banda.
So my question is, with the challenges, how should women really respond to that? Because the scary thing is, that some people are not welcoming it, but you still want to make a difference.
Can we use that in summarizing quickly in 1 minute, unfortunately?
When we were talking at the back about the ability of men and women to the ability of men to network in a way that's quite aggressive, that women shy away from, it got me thinking about one of the questions I get asked the most about the job I do in Parliament. I spend a lot of time shouting at President Zuma, and people say to me, don't you feel you should be a little bit more respectful since he's old enough to be your father and he's a man and you're both Zulu? And I say, no, we're both elected public representatives. I have a job and he has a job, and my job is to hold him accountable for his job. But again, there's a constant pressure as a woman to be smaller and quieter and less abrasive and less in your face.
Absolutely.
Because God forbid anyone should be challenged by a woman, let alone a young woman, who does she think she is? And so again, the only way to redefine is to shout louder and to be more abrasive, so that young women who are coming up think, oh, well, if she can shout, I can have a shout, because it's our responsibility. And if she can be aggressive, I can be aggressive. Yes.
Yes, just very
Thank you,
quickly,
Lindy.
I think there are two ways of doing this. There's certainly a role for shouting for all of us. There's also a time for lobbying. And I think women need to be astute enough to know this is the platform for shouting, this is a platform where I lobby. So that's important. But also, I just wanted to throw out a challenge. A Ugandan friend of mine, a lovely lady called Maria Odindo, told me that she believes that, and I have other friends who say they don't believe women are their own worst enemies. That's not what I'm saying. But she believes that in many ways we sometimes contribute. So you bring up your children in the rural area, maybe more than the city, but you say to your son, discipline your sister. She's not doing ABCD. You create platforms in the house where the girl is put in a certain place, the boy is put in a certain place, and you feed those stereotypes. So just to encourage us all, as we bring up our kids, our nephews, our nieces, our families, to always keep in mind, what am I saying? How am I saying it? What young man and young woman am I growing out of these children? Just very important.
Absolutely. And
The last
Richang,
point.
just one
Last point, yeah.
last point.
One of the stereotypes that you face, especially in leadership position, is that you are expected to be there with an entourage. And typically in my industry, I have to do a lot of work with ministers, and I have to go to a lot of meetings to profile the company. And I remember my first meeting with the Minister of Minerals. I walked in there, and one of the things that I think we need to do as women is when we've got these jobs, we need to really up the game. We need to work hard and prepare really, really well. So when I walked in there, I remember the gentleman who was waiting for me to say, "Is it just you?" And I said, yes, it is just me. And we walked into the boardroom of the minister, and it was a whole entourage of his team and just me. And I walked in there and I talked about what I came to deliver. And the minister was nodding. I didn't use that statement to stop me or make me shrink and say, I can't do it. I had prepared, and I said, it will be just like any other boardroom. We need to do that.
Thank you so much to the panel.